usually when I see people working with trees, they have like really big trucks. So, but when I saw y'all, I noticed that you guys had the vans. What made you choose this?
I think we chose the van at first out of necessity because it was really all we had, right? I mean, that was, your vehicle was the Ford Transit, and the only thing I had was a Jeep, so it was like, what can we do with the Jeep? And
right,
so it just like made sense that this would be the work vehicle that we made our sort of like everyday.
Mm-hmm.
We have to figure out how we're going to use, this work vessel we have in order to do the type of work that we ultimately wanted to do. And, in the beginning, if anyone's seen our presentations or have been following us, like we started just by stuffing brush into an empty van.
I think it might be important here to say like the reason we did that was because of we had lost our jobs or quit our jobs while we were working primarily with a company that wasn't really working in the best interest of trees, and we were making observations around that time in our careers that a lot of the common practices that tree care businesses do, it sort of defies what it actually means to be an arborist. Like when we were working, we were really just like cutting limbs off of trees and telling people that was good for them. And like as you and I just got smarter and started thinking more about things in a deeper way, we realized pretty quickly, like this is sort of the way that you would make a business if you were anti-tree, not pro-tree.
We got into the industry caring about trees and liking trees, so it was clear like removals weren't really on the table for us.
Yeah.
So, it's like, well, if I'm not going to be removing trees, why do I need
what do I actually need?
Yeah, what do I need outside of that? And frankly, it's like not very much. And we had a good majority of that just being, climbers. Yeah. We had our hand saws, we had a chainsaw, ropes, harnesses, so
it just made sense. A, we had it already, and B, it's just much less overhead. And we found that, or rather we thought, one of the reasons that we were doing all of this like major tree surgery or killing trees that didn't need to be killed was to perpetuate the business model that was what we've been calling big arb. We thought that if you didn't have to pay off these huge chippers, this $250,000 lift, all this big stuff, then there goes to the incentives to kill and remove trees. And since we didn't want to do that, we were left with, okay, so how do we equip actually to not do any of that? How do we equip to take care of trees?
Yeah. Turns out everything you need to take care of a tree just fits in a van pretty well. So
there is no shortage of people in the area, in our area at least. There's no shortage of people who kill and do that kind of stuff to trees.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought that once we had a few experiences interacting with the clients and actually explaining to them why, hey, let's not do this, let's do this instead, and list the reasons why their idea isn't great and why there's an alternative idea that can accomplish the goals while minimizing the damage to the tree. We found that in conversation, we were doing a lot of work. In conversation, we were undoing these ideas that people had in their heads that that's what you needed to do to trees.
Yeah. There is a philosophy behind why we also chose to work out of a van, other than practicality, other than like we didn't have any other vehicles to use that sort of made sense. Part of that philosophy was that we sort of noticed that the public's relationship with the tree care industry was one that was,
it's not that great.
It's not that great. We just had that talk when we went to the Midwest chapter about like there was a survey that like really, it focused on like the public's perception of arborists, and basically the public's perception of arborists was that like we're everything that's wrong with trees, and which just seems sort of like,
hang on a second, that's
Yeah.
not what it's supposed to be. While Jack and I were employed to be tree cutters, we were doing things that weren't good for trees, but we were doing them because that's what the client wanted.
Mhm.
Even though the client isn't that educated on like
tree biology.
or tree risk or why this might not be a good idea. And we thought that if we could reach the client, they would not, ultimately the client makes the decision with their trees. And if we could reach them and educate them about good management, that they would do that.
And also like you kind of have to also tell the client, yeah, that's not a good idea. Like that's,
You got to be direct.
yeah,
Yeah.
and explain why, why removing this entire stem going towards their house is a bad idea.
Right. Yeah, this may hollow out.
It's like
and-
talking people out of the work that they expect.
So it sort of defies some of like the common practices that tree companies rely on. Tree companies rely on big sales to pay off the $250,000 lift
Yeah.
or the new chipper. Like that's what they rely on. And we thought that since we have a low overhead because we were just operating out of a van, we don't have that huge sales incentive. And for both the outcomes of our work and for branding,
And maintaining just integrity as an arborist.
that's a great point.
Yeah.
That we didn't have to compromise on our ethics as arborists and as people who love nature. I don't have to say yes to everything. I don't have
Yeah.
to pay off, and I can make nearly the same amount of money doing good things for trees or good things for their risk or for their stress, and not feel guilty at the end of the day.
Yeah, you can literally afford to walk away.
Yeah. And we think that perhaps there's a feedback loop between having a van and having like good philosophy with trees. While you and I are pruning, we're seldom making cuts bigger than 6 inches in diameter.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't make sense for us to have a big intimidator chipper.
Yeah.
I think someone could argue that when you see our finished van build, they would argue this is the same cost as a medium-sized chip truck and chipper combo.
Mm-hmm.
And to that, I would say yes, but we didn't start from that point. We grew into that.
Yeah.
So often we do say that the startup costs for having a van and having this type of stuff is lower, and I still maintain that. But just like every other business model, it matures. It does evolve to more specifically meet your needs. So while yes, our big new van outfit is nice and certainly more expensive than our first build, though that doesn't mean that it's less of a good model. So at first, this model made sense for us because it was cheaper.
Yeah. And it was functional. Like,
Yes.
like we didn't, aside from like, being able to, like the little things that sort of bugged us about the shorter van, like being able to stand up, having some extra moving room. You can put more things in there, I guess. But like,
Yeah,
functionality wise, it operates almost the same as the original van.
totally.
So,
It just grew up. Oftentimes we do tell people, like, if you're starting up, you ought to consider a van build.
yeah.
It is cheaper. And perhaps you do use that as a stepping stone to getting a bigger rig or whatever you would want. We just happened to, when we reached that fork in the road, we chose like, well, let's keep
the van.
Yeah, let's refine this to see like what its actual limits are.
Yeah.
And what can we still do with this form factor. And while that still is changing ever so slightly, I think we are closer to having something really refined that other people can emulate.
Yeah. And ultimately build off
Yeah.
of.
And if you do have the capital to start up in this way,
You can just do the,
just I think that having smaller equipment prevents you from
overreaching.
and doing silly things with trees. And so perhaps if you are already a knowledgeable arborist and one who cares about trees but isn't certain about how to go off on their own, perhaps this form factor can be something that you can look at and really consider as a viable alternative to like the big arb setup.
There are little things that, aren't ideal about the van. Like, for instance, we have to bring another vehicle if we want to haul material off. Being in a van, like, you hear all the equipment rattling and stuff down the road.
Yeah, there's certain roads I won't drive on.
Yeah. Aside from those like little annoyances, it prevents us from doing big stuff or makes larger projects a little bit more difficult, and we have to be a little more strategic on it. But we have, good relationships with people that have larger equipment. We're not saying that like this has to be all you use. Like, use other resources too to your advantage. So, if for instance, we have to do a huge snag. Let's say there was a tree that's, at risk of coming down, and we have to, decrown it. I mean, that's going to be a lot of large wood that, frankly, we're not built to handle. So,
money we're not making.
Money we're not making, but also less headache. Like, I don't have to deal with that, material, which is nice.
Yeah. And, it might be worth saying that the big arb model does have to exist. And there's contexts where it makes sense. But, like, since you and I can't do these huge storm damage cleanup jobs, if everyone was built this way, no one is there to do
no one could get that.
So it does have to exist
alongside
it. And they fill different niches, and I don't really like saying that. But they occupy different spaces in arboriculture.
You're filling different needs. Maybe instead of niche we say needs. Because I think there is a need for production arboriculture. There is a need for heavy equipment to deal with a lot of material, but there's also a need for like good arboriculture. And I would say that if we looked at the ratio of like good arboriculture to just your standard tree work, there's way more standard tree work going on than like good arboriculture. So
I agree with that. Like to be on a little tangent here, I suppose, like you ought to have a reason. Our friend Dallas was just saying this. You have to have a reason for every single cut. And you ought to be able to explain why each cut is adding some benefit to the tree, not to appease the client. The client appeasement is important, but at the end of the day, they're calling you to have good input. And to take care of their tree. They're actually not calling you to just say yes.
Well, and you'll appease the client because hopefully after you leave the conversation, like you guys will be on the same page of like what to expect. And I think we've talked about this before, but like, proper expectations. So like, it's rare for us to have a client that is like scratching their head at the work that we did. Because I think, we've communicated and set the expectations up well.
This is where we're going to make the cuts. This is what the soil zone is going to look like after we build it.
So it's, you will appease the customer if you take the time to explain why you're doing what you're doing.
But if you have to do that, if you're saying yes to them removing a primary stem, how do you explain that this is good for the tree? You can't really. Because it's
without lying.
Right. And this is a conflict with when you have big sales quotas to hit with a big arb setup. You are incentivized to say yes to more things. I think as a fact, to resolve one of the issues that most of our clients keep their wood chips, but some don't, and we had to figure out again, how do we haul these chips off without bringing a second vehicle or while staying as small as possible? And that led to the creation of the dump box that we never named, but it was this janitor's tote that we designed to mount to a custom metal frame that attached to the hitch. And this could hold like a cubic yard nearly.
of wood chips.
And it would dump either left or right.
Yeah. Yeah, it had a swivel
in the center of it.
Yeah, so you could pull the pin and then choose to dump it left or right with a little bit of scooping. But yeah, totally functional. I think that.
Yeah, this was just a determined experiment
Yeah.
to see how far we could push this thing and not have to surrender to the big arb format.
Yeah, yeah, and it worked. It worked well.
It did work.
Yeah,
and with pruning that aligns with good standards, often if we were working on a single tree, that was all the dump space that we actually needed.
Yeah, it was rare that we had to do 2 trips to the dump. I mean,
yeah,
you know,
it happened, but not that often.
Yeah,
and keep in mind that most of the time we're not hauling anything.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is another integral part, I think, of just having a van.
Yeah,
is being able to communicate. How do you get people? This is me actually asking you. How do you get people to keep their wood chips?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few different strategies that I use. I don't know how you necessarily do it, but I sort of try to gauge the client and see kind of like what their incentive might be for keeping the wood chips, right? So like on our work orders, we have hauling as being an optional service. It's its own service. It's itemized that way. So if there might be some like financial incentive for them to not have stuff hauled away, I'll sort of lean on that. But if I'm meeting with the client and I sort of get the notion that these people are environmentally conscious and they, really sort of align with environmental stewardship, I'll sort of lean on that a little bit more, saying like, as part of an initiative to remain sustainable and like have good practices, like we opt for we prefer our customers to keep their biomass. Anything that they generate, stays on site. Yeah, and that takes sort of like, you kind of got to feel the client out, I think. But I sort of lean into those two things depending on how I gauge, who I'm talking with.
I think I do those same things as well. And that, I will not always choose the same place in the conversation to make that statement. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it happens up front. It's not like a formula that we're following necessarily, especially if they live in a woodland. It's
an easy sell.
It's an easy unsell.
Or unsell, yeah.
And while we're making less money hauling things away, it just means that when we're done, we're done.
Yeah,
we leave, and that is a big part of just having a van. Is I think it's an inseparable part of having just the van. That if I had to haul every time, if I had a van, I'm going to also then have a trailer permanently attached to that van if I have to haul every time.
Yeah.
I think when you are working with a big arb company, it's just implied that you're taking the material off site. Sometimes people are surprised to hear that, I can just not pay for that.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm not a business person, but when I hear that other folks don't charge for that, it's confusing to me.
Yeah.
It's another service. It's way more time. You have to, do something with those chips. It certainly should be something that clients are paying additionally for.
Yeah.
And not only just as a convenience measure, but also as like an ecological one.
But, I think part of the reason why material always goes is that you're not getting that chipper off into the backyard to, chip into their garden.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like the chipper setup that we have allows for access to certain areas, which is a huge, can be a huge advantage for us, but also has been a disadvantage when we have a front yard tree that we're working and the client wants to keep their wood chips, but they're like, I want it in the far back corner of my backyard.
It's a long drag.
So, you can kind of...
Yeah, and, the drag length is something that, by and large, we do less dragging than if we had a regular setup.
But there are those times where you're like, oh, shit,
I forgot about this.
Yeah,
certainly.
Yeah.
I think also when a big arb setup is doing work if they've oversold something and are making big cuts and stuff, they are producing far more wood chips.
Mm-hmm.
It's harder to get someone to keep 5 yards of chips versus 1 yard of chips.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
what are some of the things, I guess, that the van setup has allowed us to do that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do with a big
chip in the
rig?
backyard.
Yeah, chip in the back. Yeah, that's a huge one.
Yeah, if we're working on big trees in the back and the wood chips are staying on site, if they're staying in the back, the drag path is 25 feet. Versus if we were parked in front, backyard trees, that drag path is 50 yards. So fatigue on the ground is decreased by having high chipper mobility. To compare it with the big arb setup, that's all been done, kind of, you know.
Yeah, you know, like what you can do with that setup. But I think the van is a blank canvas, and there's a lot of freedom that comes with that.
With the chip truck, it does one thing.
Yeah.
It collects chips.
Yeah.
Stores some equipment. With a van, though,
it's multi-purpose.
It's multi-purpose. We have a pruning van and a soil van, you know, and both have the benefit of being a flexible space and that is enclosed, and all the benefits that come with each of those things. All of the vehicles that we're using, aside from the truck, have those benefits.
Yeah.
Enclosed space, highly mobile, not huge, don't need to have CDLs to drive, easier to own, maintain, and to store, to keep. Yeah, I just think that every other profession that uses vans had it figured out.
Yeah, before we did.
Way before we did. And it's
every other trade uses vans.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. Construction,
your handymans,
handyman, electricians.
Yeah, they all use van setups.
Yeah, it's funny that it's so not common to see arboriculture using vans, but there is a space for it.
Yeah.
Calling it now, as like younger arborists are coming up, I think they're going to be less tolerant to the bullshit of big arb, and I think they're going to be like, yeah, like this ain't it.
Yeah.
And while, you know, again, there is a place for it, I think when they're shown the two options and you know, pros and cons are weighed out, I think more practitioners would opt for a van setup than the big arb setup.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be younger people generally. I don't think it's going to be a lot of the old dogs.
The clients generally think the van is sweet, to be honest. Yeah, I can't tell you the amount of times like people are curious to how, like, you know, when we say, oh yeah, we're going to come out and like prune this large, mature tree, and then we pull up to the house in just this van, they're kind of scratching their heads like, all right, like how, like when's everyone else showing up, you know, or like when's the heavy equipment showing up?
They have a perception that big trees require big machines to work with. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's just kind of, there's been a lot of like just general interest from our clients that like, can I see? I'm like, yeah. At
first they wanted to see, and like, we would reluctantly show them.
Well, because we had a shag rug in there and like, you know, bolted.
We weren't particularly proud of that.
Yeah.
But like version, I don't know, 2 or 3, it was presentable, and people were genuinely, even like these are non-tree people.
Yeah.
Just people that, you know.
Just curious.
Yeah. So not only did that like make us feel good, but also it demonstrates the fact that people like seeing deliberate thought, and they like seeing effort and trying something new. And for our brand, it was a good thing to do. Because not only are we being environmentally conscious by making all these deliberate choices, but we're also taking a risk on it. There's a reason that everyone has the same setup.
Yeah.
And we were deviating from that. So to the client's perception, it shows confidence. Like, oh, you guys actually know
why you're doing
what you're doing.
Yeah. And I think for me too, it sort of reinforced all of these expectations that clients have when it comes to what to expect when a tree company comes to work on their trees, or just expectations in general.
Mm-hmm.
Like people just have this sort of historical thought of like what a tree company sort of looks like. And yeah, when that reality is sort of altered a little bit, it's, you know, a little bit shocking.
Mm-hmm.
And
In a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. Yeah, just another testament to like how ingrained a lot of things are from the industry, not really progressing in any sort of way.
Yeah,
you know,
you touched on this earlier when you said that client expectations, there's a feedback loop between those two things. And one way that that feedback loop is broken, we talked about, is conversation. But another one is just the example of our setup.
Yeah.
That we're not doing it that way.
Yeah. And people like that, man.
Yeah, they do.
Like people like to think like, oh, I got people that are different. Like, you know, like these are my arborists are different than your tree guys.
Yeah.
You know, like they like that kind of feeling of, you know, exclusivity and like, you know, it's sort of novel, you know.
Yeah, for brand building, you got to have that.
Yeah.
It wasn't just using a new model for its own sake. You know, it was because we saw issues with the current model.
Yeah.
And we could articulate those, and, you know, we knew the negative effects of those. You know, it wasn't just like, yeah, we wanted to be creatively different. It was like, well, there's a huge problem here that no one else is solving.
Yeah.
And so part of it is that while that was all true, it's something we wore on our sleeves. When clients would ask us, like, why is this what you have? Well, we would explain it to them. You know, well, there's some issues with how things are normally done.
Yeah.
And they like that is not only are we good at the work, but we're thinking about the space that we're in our industry.
I think when you have a low overhead, you make quality arboriculture accessible because we're able to have competitive prices for better quality of work. Like, yeah, our prices are competitive, and the quality of the work, you know, not to like really toot our own horns here, but like the quality is better.
Yeah,
you know?
We're really focused on having good outcomes.
Yeah, and I think Sam put it the best is that you have more, you can afford more time to do the delicate work that's, you know, intentional, and I think that comes with the territory.
What comes next?
As far as the van goes?
Sure. Do we have plans to make a new van? Do we have plans to change the current van?
I think the pruning van is refined, and I don't have enough gripes with it to really change too much about it. I think the pruning van is awesome. It's functional.
I think I agree with that too.
But I think the next project of ours is making a soil van. One that we have one, but it's not as refined, I think, as our pruning rig. It's functional, and I think it works for sure, but it's certainly not in the same.
We want to, since we do so many root crown excavations and decompaction zones, that it would be worthwhile for us to have a tow behind air compressor powerful enough to do those things. Currently, we just rent one, but finding a way to fit that into a van and you know, exhaust it out of the van, there's some thinking that needs to be done. But I think ideally we'd like to have both a liquid tank, and a compressor in the same space.
And we do have the liquid tank. It's the compressor that we're kind of brainstorming on.
Yeah. It has to be small enough to fit, yet
powerful enough
to do the thing.
Yeah.
But that's probably our next van project. Where we don't do too much showing of the soil van, but we can if folks are interested in seeing that. Yeah, it's at the stage that the other van, the pruning van, was at a few years ago.
Before we got the larger
Yeah.
high top van.
Yeah, it's got a nice floor, it's got nice shelves, it's got a nice tank.
It is the old van.
Yeah, the old van is becoming that.
Yeah. So, and I think both of us just like the creativity of trying to. We make our own problems and then we try to solve them. But yeah, those solutions are fun to figure out. And play with, and then hopefully, we think that showcasing the van and sort of our philosophy on operating smaller is a good thing for the industry and other people looking into getting into this type of work. And hopefully, if we can showcase a good soil van, we can incentivize people to not only get more into soil work, but to have another avenue where you can
help trees.
Yeah.